Okay. Hello, everyone. Welcome to this online event. Today, we are happy to say that Avril Joy has joined us, and the director of Lynn Press, Lynn Michell, will be asking Avril Joy about her new novel, The Silent Woman, and her creation of the asylum and its voices. We will be taking questions from the audience in the last 10 to 15 minutes. If you would keep that in mind and share them in the chat. Please ensure that your mics are turned off, and we will be recording this event. So just please reach out or leave a message in the chat if you have any objections to that. The event is free, but we are happy to take donations. Now, with all that said, I hand this over to Lynn.
Thanks, Aisling. And I just want to say a big thank you to Aisling because this is her first event with Linen Press. She's only just come along and joined our team and she's set it up. She's done everything. So thank you, Aisling. We're very grateful to you. We're going to be talking about how we create the whole world inside a novel. It's almost like playing God, isn't it? Where you build not just the characters, but the environment, the context, the voices. And I want to talk to Avril in particular because her latest book, her latest novel, The Silent Women, is narrated by three different voices and more. There are three key voices, women inside the asylum, and there are others who tell this story. And it's quite complex, it's detailed, it's totally believable. And I think Avril's a very good writer to talk to about creating a world that is real, credible, just utterly believable. So let's start with The Silent Women, though, Avril, do talk about sometimes the River Song too, if you want, if it's relevant. In a way, I'm going to ask you the impossible, which is how does a book like this, how does a story like this start? And there are all these elements. There are the characters, their appearance, their voices, the context, the asylum, the story, the backstory, the history of the women. It's like little bits of a patchwork quilt. What comes to you first, or is it a stupid question? Is it more that you pick up little bits and pieces, almost pluck them out of the sky?
Um, I think it probably is the little bits and pieces thing. I think it is quite hard to separate the various strands that come at the beginning and where they really come from and what you actually start with. But I've been thinking about it because obviously I knew we were going to talk about this. And I think for me, number one, setting is always a catalyst for me. Where I I think about where I'm going to set my novel, and it has to be somewhere that makes me feel quite excited. Oh, I want to write about that place because, after all, I'm going to spend the next several years in that place, so I may as well be
Mm.
vested in it. And if I think about sometimes the River Song, that was definitely the case. That the place came first. That I'd seen a documentary about the White River. I was fascinated by the people that lived there. And I thought, yeah, I'd like to write about that one day with no idea really of how and why, how I would do that, how it would happen. And so I think I'll come on to the Silent Women because I think it's quite parallel actually. So if I just say with sometimes the River
Mm.
Song, I had that feeling, I came back to that place and I've obviously I'm very interested in writing about place. I'm interested in landscape, in how we live in it, how we move through it, what lies under the land, and all these things. So I had that, but that's not enough. Obviously, you've got to have characters and stories. So I began to look for the people who lived there. And that really took the form of writing a couple of short stories. And from those short stories emerged my protagonist, Ayana. And if I think about the Silent Women, it's been the same kind of process actually, that almost the first strand is almost the setting for me, because some years ago, and for some time now, I've wanted to write an East Anglian novel because I've lived there. I have an affinity to the place. It's quite like the place I grew up in, very flat, wide skies, watery. And some time ago, you'll know, Lynn, I wrote a series of short stories that were set in East Anglia. And amongst those stories was one, I mean, they weren't published, but there was one called Wild Flower. And I loved that story. I loved it. And I think even when I wrote it, I knew I would come back to that. So starting The Silent Women for me was really coming back to that short story and ignoring anything that happened in that short story, but just picking up on the setting and the character of Alice, who is one of my three protagonists. So I had the setting, I had a character, and I knew from that short story that she'd been incarcerated in an asylum at one point in her life. And of course, straight away, I'm thinking, well, that interests me because I've worked, in a place. I've worked in a women's prison. I know that world. I can write about it. So those are the strands that were coming together really early on for me, I think. And I don't do any writing at that stage. It's just thinking, just letting it all kind of stew in my head. And even early on like that, I've starting to read a little bit about asylums or different things. So the strands are getting bigger and bigger and they're all filling my head. But one last thing I would say about that is I try not to pin it down then. I try not to make decisions about this will happen and that will happen. Because, it's just a tiny seed that has to grow of its own accord somehow or in the process of writing. So I don't know if that answers the question, but that's kind of where I begin.
I think it's a very hard question to ask and answer, and I don't think there is a simple answer to it. I know that we've talked in the past about neither of us being post-it writers. There are writers that put post-its of the entire plot all the way around their walls, but that's not how I experience writing. That's not how you experience writing. It's almost more of an organic. It's an organic process in which whatever it is you're thinking about contributes to your thinking, and then you contribute to them and they contribute to you, and the whole thing gets pieced together and grows organically. But how do we explain this to other writers?
In the way you're making choices as well, because there are all sorts of things that can happen as a novel begins to grow. It can go in all kinds of directions. And so one of the things that I think we don't talk about enough actually is where we talk about the writing, but we don't talk about the thinking that goes on behind it and the kind of choices we have to make. Well, will I go down this route of it? Will I have two characters, three? How, that there's a lot of thinking as well at that stage, I think. And that's why, to me, if you pin it down, the thinking is very linear and not very exciting. You're not leaving room for all sorts of possibilities if you do the post-it notes.
A lot of that thinking doesn't happen at the desk in front of the screen, does it? It goes on in other places, and it can bubble up in the most unusual places and at odd times, like middle of the night or in the shower or walking the dog. You suddenly think,
definitely, yeah.
Because
the head by then is full of all these strands, really. Yeah, definitely.
And do you live inside that place right through the writing of whichever novel you're writing? Do you find that you're immersed in it?
Yeah, I do to some extent. And I remember that in Sometimes a River Song, I used to go around the house talking in Ayana's voice because she has one protagonist in Sometimes a River Song. It's a more straightforward narrative, if you like. And she has quite a distinctive voice. And so I would find that I would be going around the house talking in her voice, so I really did feel that I inhabited her. As far as the Silent Women is concerned, there were more people to inhabit, so I didn't quite have that same
Mm.
feeling of inhabiting, but certainly the place, because again and again it reminded me and resonated with me, with the prison. And so it would take me, I felt like I knew the place I was walking in, um,
Yeah.
even though it was different. I still felt I knew it. Sometimes I think when I'm writing, the characters are really in my head and the whole place. And then I know I'm not going to be able to write for a bit, or I'm not sure what's going to happen. So I think this sounds a bit mad, but in my head, I have this stage and I put them over onto one side of the stage and I say, right, we've got here now. Now just wait there. And I always have them somehow waiting in the wings. And I think that's because sometimes I need a break from them. And then maybe they need a break from me. And so then when I'm ready, I'll just go and collect them again and carry on. It's a weird thing. I have to kind of see it visually that this is what happens. Otherwise, I'd live inside it all the time, I think, which then I'd go
Oh,
mad.
yes, wonderful. You park them.
I do. I
You
park them.
park them. You put them in a car park,
Yeah.
and you. Oh, that's wonderful. And they stay there. Are they
They're
good?
very
Do they
good.
stay put until you're ready to
Yeah,
release them?
definitely.
Okay, let me go on. Um, it's fascinating. I don't think we can describe the process of writing. Coming to the conclusion, it's all so opaque. It's very difficult to do. But in The Silent Women, what's one of the things that strikes me is all my senses are engaged. It's not just hearing the characters, it's not just seeing the asylum, but you talk about things that they feel, the walls, the rough blankets on their bed, and the smells, the vinegar, and the horrible gristly stews. You create all of that, all five senses playing together. Is there an answer to that? I mean, can you explain how you do that?
Oh,
Am I
I mean,
asking
I
the
think
impossible?
so. I think no, I don't think you are, because I think that is quite deliberate in a way. I mean, I do really enjoy writing that is rich in the senses and detail. I mean, as a reader, I enjoy that, so I would be inclined to write
Yeah,
like that anyway. But I think, if you want to create a world that is authentic and believable, one of the ways you can do that is through the use of the senses, and particularly if those senses are located in one of your protagonists. So you're smelling the world, hearing the world through her person, as it were. And I think that's, well, I was thinking about this. Hilary Mantel says, or she said in one of her Wreath lectures, it's the writer's job to put the reader in the moment, even if that moment is centuries ago. And I think that's absolutely right. I do think it's the writer's job. Otherwise, why, if I can't do that, if I can't create this world in some way that's believable or authentic, then the reader's not really going to go on that journey with me.
yeah,
So I think, and particularly with this book, I set myself the challenge of taking the reader. It was very much something I wanted to do, because I felt I know the sounds, the smells, the taste, the senses. I know what they're like in a closed institution, because I've worked in one for so long.
mm,
All right, it's not exactly the same, but it's very similar. And
mm,
so I wanted to give that to the reader. I mean, that was my challenge, I think, to myself. Can I create that dark, sort of claustrophobic world so that it's believable? And I think there are different ways you can do it, but one of the ways you can do it is through concentrating on the senses. And
yeah,
these are silent women. But someone said to me at the launch in the bookshop launch I had, it's kind of, there's a lot about silence and the power of silence, but it's this really noisy book. And she had picked up on
yeah,
the different
yes,
noises that were going on. And yeah, but I think, and a lot of those that she picked up on, they were deliberate. I thought about that a lot, and I put them there. I wonder, I should read the very beginning of when we go into the asylum, and
Yes,
maybe
yes,
sort of show
yeah.
kind of how I did that then a little more clearly.
Is this
So
Simone? Is this
yeah,
Simone? Which
when she
character,
wakes up,
Simone? We should explain
yes,
that there are three
yeah,
characters, three women shut in this asylum, and part of the story is about the bond they form. Three very very different women, but the bond is very strong, and they work together. And Simone, we you introduce the asylum to us through her senses, don't you? Through her eyes and ears. Okay, yeah, it'd
yeah.
be nice to hear that.
I do. There is a slight preface to that where I situate the asylum and I talk about what lies to the north, wild uncultivated fen, what lies to the south, the chalk downland. I try and place it within its landscape and give the feel of that
Mm,
exterior landscape. But then we enter the asylum, as Lynn says, with Simone Gastrell, who's a young woman who's been incarcerated there really by her adulterous husband. And this is the first time we come into the asylum. It's called Long Meadow. Long Meadow, a room adjoining dormitory 12. Simone Gastrell. She dreams of the child. She dreams of spinning glass, of an ascension of larks, a sky blistered with wings. She dreams of the black water's edge, a tangle of river weed as she's sucked under, her skirts dragging her down. She wakes, breathless, her head aches, and the familiar sweet scent of rotting hyacinth curls about her. She opens her eyes, looks up, and wonders where she lies. Then she remembers. In the dark, airless silence, she hears the beating of her heart. A cold sweat on her skin, she sits up, lowers her feet to the stone floor, and moves across to the window, drawing up the canvas blind. A sky like a bruise, a pale moon with a ghostly trail of stars hang above her, and the distant thud, thud of the pumps echo the beat of her heart. She turns from the window. Moonlight spills into the room, falling on the wooden chair and table, on the mottled cover of a book of common prayer, on the buttons at the cuff of a linsey dress draped on the chair back. It settles like snow on a corner of the iron bedstead and in the narrow gap beneath the locked door. It lights the blanched face of the counterpane, the whitewashed walls, the waxen bed linen. Nothing here familiar. No colour, no comfort, no ornamentation, no ceiling rose, plaster cornice, curtain, carpet, all absent, all leached of colour. But then, on the corner of the pillowcase, a freckle of dried blood set in the heat of a wash. The blood of another woman? Who might she be? Did she inhabit this room? Is she now gone from Longmeadow? A glimmer of hope, a ruffled feather on a raven's wing catches her. Perhaps such a woman walks freely in the world. If so, then how? How might a woman captive, entombed, be set free? So that's where we meet Simone and the asylum the first time. And I think what I tried to do then as a writer is get in really, really close so that you're seeing all the small details right down eventually to that tiny freckle of blood
yes.
on a pillowcase, which actually proves the sort of prompt for, in a way, the whole question of the book. How can a woman incarcerated be free? So yeah, I think if we're trying, which we're talking about creating the world of the novel, this is one way to do it, going in very close up with the senses kind of alert, the small details. And it's in the present tense, which I think gives it
Yes.
immediacy. I think it's worth thinking about tense. And there's also a mood and a tone going on right from the beginning. And I actually wrote down some of the words. I mean, there's I definitely have this propensity for the Gothic, I think, underlying what I write. And the words here are ghostly, raven, blood, entombed, bruise, iron. There are a lot of words in that short passage, really, that I think are setting a kind of the tone of the novel, because I think that's, every novel is going to have its tone and its mood, as well as its actual setting or its place. So I think those are some of the ways, if we're asking the question, how do we create the world of the novel, I think there are other ways, but I think that's how I've gone
Mm,
about it there. I mean, and you can't go on going on like that, obviously, because things have to move on. But
yes.
that close-up detail is still very important at times, I think, anyway.
I love
And
it.
so that,
I love it.
yeah,
I love the way you let us linger on things that we can see and touch. And it does take us deep into the place. And then what you do in other scenes is you come out. So it's like a camera with a close focus and a long focus
yeah,
lens.
yeah.
And that works because instead of sticking with the single focus, you're moving it all the time. You're standing back, going in, taking a middle view, going in again. It takes skill, though, to do that. And thinking of the submissions that come in, not many have that detailed touch of going deep inside and making us feel intimately connected with a place or a person or an idea or whatever. That kind of detail's missing, and I like it. Maybe not everybody does, but I like what you do very much. And as I said, it's not as if you do it all the way through. You're panning in, panning out. It's like a man with a camera filming the book and changing lenses all the time, but you do it very well. I mean, this is a very masterly book. I think it's it has great strengths and it deals with important issues and it deals with feminist issues and about containment and about misogyny and about violence. But that's not what drives us through the reading. It's the characters you create, Avril, and the detail that you're writing about. So it is the story, the narrative that keeps us reading. It's you are able to weave the themes into your story, so they're part and parcel of it. And
Well,
I mean, going on, carrying on, same with the same idea of creating the world. I want to talk about the way you use the different women with the very different voices. You've got Simone, who's the most conventional in terms of the way she sees. Well, she's new to the asylum, so she brings with her a normal outside world. Some of the others have been in there much longer, and in a way, their vision is warped by being contained. So you have Simone, who presents a fairly conventional perspective, and you write her scenes in what we would call ordinary prose, I
normal.
suppose.
Yeah, okay. And it's
And then
third
you've
person.
got it's third person, and then Alice Semple is completely different. I mean, maybe you should explain it, not me. And then Phoebe is incredible. Phoebe, the very damaged young woman whose voice is Avril presents her voice down the right hand side of the page, and it's right aligned, isn't it? And it's
Yeah,
left all jagged.
I'm
I,
trying to.
I just want to ask you how you developed. Have you got a bit you can show? A bit of Phoebe with the
Yeah,
jagged left hand margins. It's
yeah.
amazing.
Yeah, well,
How did you come up with those,
yeah,
not just the three voices, which is oral, but
yeah.
the three ways of presenting their voices on the page?
Well, I think that I said before that I wanted to challenge myself, and in terms of getting into the asylum, I think the whole book for me, I like to learn things. I like to do something different, and even before the characters were really fully developed, I had an interest in how the text would look. And I think that's probably because
Mm,
I also write quite a lot of poetry. And at one point,
mm,
I thought that part of the novel might be delivered in a poetic form, but then
mm,
it occurred to me that I wasn't really going to write pastiche, Victorian poetry, that I was not by it, as in possession, and I didn't actually want to do that. But I was still looking for different ways of, very consciously looking for that difference in text and how it would look on the page. That interested me. And roundabout, which I'll probably talk about a bit later, I discovered this document. I discovered the governance document, which is, actually from 18, whenever it was. I can't remember now. And that
57.
was
57.
67, 57, thank you, Lynn. And that
57,
was
I
such
think.
a, whatever. It was such a find for me because it was contemporary text that, for one thing, it just blew the novel apart in a sense. I was already thinking, I'm going offline here, you have to drag me back, but I was already thinking,
Doesn't matter.
just write this about these three women, because so much, in a closed environment, is so much about power and what is happening with what you might call the officers of an establishment, the people in charge. And I was having to develop them. And then I found this governance document, which outlined all these roles like superintendent and matron and chaplain. And I'm thinking, as I'm reading it, God, I know all these people. I knew them in the prison. It's so
Yes.
high, the hierarchy of the prison. And so it was very creative bit of research, really, because it allowed me to develop characters, but also it fed into this thing I was having about text. So I decided, right, I'll actually use that text, in the novel itself. I needed somebody to take the story through. I knew that. And so that's why I felt Simone should be third person, straightforward narrative, really. I mean, there's some backstory there, but I'm big on story. If I'm reading something, I want story.
Mm,
Don't just
yeah.
want
Yeah.
how hard it was in an asylum. I want to get involved and so on. And so,
Yeah.
because originally I started with Alice and Phoebe, but I knew I needed somebody to carry the story in a different way. And I knew that Alice was going to be the political character, if you like, the witness, the person who tells it as it is. A woman dies and they send us men. That's the kind of thing Alice
Mm,
says. Um, and
mm,
she's the chronicler, really. And so I didn't really feel she could be the first character. And I don't know where I got the idea of the notebook from, but when I did, I thought that's great. That's another text. And then with Phoebe, I just wanted to show that I didn't want people to confuse it with poetry, because it's not poetry. So I didn't want to put it on the
yeah.
left-hand side of the page. I didn't want it to look like poetry, because it's not. So I thought, well, we'll put it on the other side of the page, because I knew it was going to be like stream of conscious, slightly disordered, slightly damaged text. And so I kind of damaged it on the page as well, really. Have I explained
It's
what? Yeah.
it's incredibly imaginative, Avril, what you've done here. The
Well, I
way
have,
you've not just heard the voices, but create the shape of their voices on the page. And the damaged young woman has this rather broken looking, rather fragmented
yeah,
looking
definitely.
written style.
I think that there are other people, I am quite interested in, I do read really widely, and there are texts now where people are experimenting with, that kind of thing. Max Porter is one. Grief is the thing with feathers, I think, and Lanny and
Yeah.
Ben Meyer's new book, Cuddy, which I mean I didn't know when I was writing this because it's only recently been published, does this in a big way. It's like this on steroids, really, the amount of different techniques. I kind of was aware of it and interested in it as well. So it doesn't just come from me, it kind of comes from my reading and looking at what other writers are doing as well. And
But you are
Jess's
telling us
memoir
how, oh,
Jess's memoir that you
Jess
published,
is,
Ghost of Birds, that
yes,
does a lot
Jess
with,
Richards' book.
yeah, yep,
It
that really
does.
interested me. Yeah.
That's experimental in that, yes, she uses different
Yeah.
shapes and different formats depending on what she's writing about and who is the
Okay.
subject and why
Yeah.
not. And she does it very well. It's hard though. I mean, to anyone listening, I don't want anyone to think that this is a simple thing to do, that you just decide to do this or this. Listening to you, Avril, I can hear how much you've thought it through and waited for it to develop in its own way. It's not a simple, easy job producing a book like this. It it takes skill and time and patience and huge imagination,
Oh,
don't you think?
did I do? Yeah, it didn't feel difficult though. It kind of wrote itself.
Sorry?
It kind of wrote itself.
Yes,
I
yes.
think
But then
yeah,
you've gathered all the ingredients. You've already got all the ingredients. And so, yes, it makes itself in the end. But you have gathered from all kinds of other
yeah,
sources what you
yeah.
need in order for it to sound so spontaneous. And it does sound completely spontaneous. I mean, do you want to read some of Phoebe or Alice?
I
Do you have
thought I would quite
a
like
bit?
to read some of Alice. I think, to be honest, Alice is my
Okay.
favorite character. She was my
Is
first.
she?
Yeah, she is my favorite. She was probably the first, and she's quite stroppy in her own way, and she sees what's going
Yeah.
on in the asylum, and she's not going to let them get away with it if she can help it, and I like that about her. This isn't quite that, but I read this bit at the launch, and there's something about reading this bit that feels really important to me, and that's because so Alice doesn't speak, only a very little. So we hear from her. She's given a notebook and the means of writing, a pencil, by a member of the house committee, the visitors who come in from the outside, because she can't speak. And so she begins to use that. And so when we hear from Alice, we're hearing from her notebook. And this is the very first
Yeah.
piece from Alice's notebook. And she's very fond of making lists and inventories. And the reason I like to read this is because all of these women that you'll hear about here, I feel that they have come out of history at me. I have read, in lots of different places about these women. I've invented their names, but to me they're very real. So, and Alice was, according to her, a lover. John Clare, the poet, was her lover. Alice maintains. It's worth mentioning. Anyway, Alice Semple's notebook, Dormitory 12, an inventory. I am, yet what I am, none cares or knows. John Clare. I write to name us so that the world may know who is hidden here. Emma Brewer believes her husband is coming to kill her, tries to choke herself with her fingers, once jumped out of a window. Mary Ann Holdsworth collects pieces of fruit and scraps of bread and calls them her babies. They go green and mouldy, but she does not like to part with them. Amelia Gray stands on her head and sings bawdy songs, bangs on the walls and doors at night. fearing her father is come to take her to his bed. Esther knocks, has fits and softening of the brain. She cries a lot, more than you would think possible for one woman, and she claims to speak with the Queen. Anne Bickerdale believes she's Mary Magdalene, and there's no sign of Jesus here. She works in the kitchens, the source of much news and gossip. Phoebe Baines eats hare and talks to bees. Poor child spends half her life in the coal cellar, and everyone knows why. Catherine O'Sullivan says she saw the devil come out and dance at dawn in the woods round about. Claims her husband was shot for poaching in Keeper's Wood, though his body was never found. Ivy Cole suckled 13 children before falling into black moods and debility, and she does not speak. Evelyn Webb cuts herself where you cannot see. I know, I have loaned her the means, for it brings her relief. Gladys Carter offers her virgin flower to all and sundry and does handstands up against the chapel wall. Dorcas Fisher wears a mask, her face beneath is crumpled and scarred. She was but 5 years and tied to the chair by her mother when a flannelette nightshirt caught fire. She is often force-fed. So that's Alice telling us in her notebook about the women who live in dormitory 12. And Simone stays in a private room because she's a private patient adjoining that dormitory. And there, I think I wanted to create a sense of, more women and the kind of women and that would have been incarcerated then. And a lot of that sort of came out of the very meager research. There isn't a great deal of research, and there's nothing hardly written in women's voices. All the voices out of the asylum tend to be, but so that's Alice, who, as I said, I think is my favorite character. Shall I put a light on, because I'm looking at the screen and
I was just going to say, I think you need to be illuminated. You're fading into the darkness.
Better.
Goodness, the evenings are getting dark again. Yeah. That's better. Now we can see you. Can I stay with that theme of where you find out things and research? Because you were delving into documents and the archives, and can you talk about how you did that and what you did and how you then wove what you found into the novel?
I did
do a lot of research.
Did, and at the back of the book, in my author's note, I do give quite a long list of key texts, or the ones that I would go back to again and again. I mean, I obviously if you're writing an historical novel, you've got to do your research. I mean, it's really big for me because I really worry about getting anything wrong. I mean, or I was the same with Arkansas, really, or offending anybody, or all of that. So research is something for me that goes on all the way through the novel. I never really stop researching apart from when I'm really getting towards the end. And so I think sometimes it's about assimilating as much of it as you can rather than referring to it directly on your page, because you don't want to sound like a history book, really. So you have to take care in that sense. I think that it's very necessary, and that's why I do it all the way through, because of course you come across things like, they're singing a hymn at Evensong in the chapel. Well, what hymn would they sing? The wonders of the internet mean you can immediately go on and find your hymn, that would be suitable, for instance. And there are lots of instances like that where it's just very necessary and you have to do the work. But also, I think for me, with this novel, it was a really creative thing, the research, because one, it gave me the governance document, which was all there fully online in the Welcome online collection, which has made its way into the novel directly and had a real impact on what I wrote. And the other thing was reading about the galvanic therapies that doctors were interested in. The Victorians were very interested in galvanic therapy. They were all giving themselves electric shocks all over the place. You know, there were machines that you could buy for your parlor and, you know, strap yourself up to. But yeah, I know. So it wasn't quite like ECT, but it, you know, but electrical therapy has been around for a long time and comes and goes in different guises within the sort of treatment of mental health. Discovering that led to another whole thread in the novel.
Yeah.
So yeah, I enjoy the research, I think. Yeah. And I will make notes and then I will refer back to notes. And then I'll think, oh, did I really make that note properly? I better find that document again and read it. I'm a bit, I do drive myself a bit mad with the research. I never quite trust what I've written down, but I think it's better to be like that than, you know, to be careless with it. So, yeah, I
And
think
because
that's me
it's a
in this.
historical novel, I don't know
Yeah,
whether you would need, well, I don't know. You would have done research for sometimes a river song. It's not the
yeah,
same kind of historical novel, but it's set in the past.
yep.
And
So
I mean,
this
that
is,
was amazing because you
and
created a riverboat community in a city and country you'd never even visited. And it's
well, that
completely
community,
real and you bring it to life.
it did exist. You know, there were communities on that river, but yeah, I'd never been. You know, I'd never been to Arkansas, so that was a big worry. Ultimately, I mean, you can find everything on the internet, but it's a big worry. Ultimately, the way I kind of resolved that was by sending it to a contact that I made in Arkansas, who knew quite a lot about the history of the White River and so on, and asked him to read some of it to to ensure that he felt it was authentic and respectful and all those things. And so I think you can write about anything, actually. And in a way, I think you should be able to write about anything. I mean, but
It's
there's a
rather
lot of
nice
work.
though, because you're
Yeah,
contradicting the, write
no,
about
I
what you
don't
know.
go there.
You've
Well,
never been to
yes,
Arkansas and you've never lived in a riverboat community, and yet you bring it to life as if you have done, which is
I
different
do
with
I
the
do
silent
think there's,
women because
yeah, yeah, different because I have lived this world
well,
in a
the
way.
silent
Very
women,
different.
you really are drawing on so much of your own experience, having been in a women's prison. Those two
Definitely.
novels, yeah, they're different, aren't they? In how you use your background, knowledge, and experience.
Yeah.
And
Strange.
I mean, I always say I think The Silent Women is the book you had to write after you're working in a prison for so long. You had to write it.
I
It's
think
taken a
that's
while
true.
for it to bubble up.
Yeah, and funnily enough, when I started it, I said this at the book launch that I mentioned before. I know this sounds crazy and hard to believe, but I didn't really. When I found the governance document, that was a different thing. But to begin with, I didn't really think it was coming out of my. I kind of thought I knew that world, but I thought this is so different. This is so very different. But
Yeah,
that it was naive of me to think like that. Um, Perhaps it was just that I was surprised to find it's not that different and that things haven't changed as much as we might think in the time. And of course, the Victorians, when they set up their asylums, did so with good intentions. You know, and they wanted their patients to
mm-hmm.
have access to work and access to the airing courts and the outside world. And there were lots of good things that they attempted to do, and things went badly wrong for them, really, when the asylums began to become very, very overcrowded in the late 19th century. That's absolutely true of prisons or of any institution. When it becomes overcrowded,
Yeah.
really, it can't,
Yeah.
live up to its ideals.
But it's an interesting contrast that you were able to write sometimes a river song about this girl living in a riverboat
Yeah.
community. And then I feel only you perhaps could have written The Silent Women, because you have put into that book everything that you know to be true about living in that kind of environment. So you've done two very different things with the two novels. Or do you feel you have?
I
Maybe you don't feel you.
I think I have. I think you're right. But um, after I'd written Sometimes a River Song, I did think to myself, well, how did I come to write that? Because it's
Yes.
nothing like the world I've lived in for the last whatever, 25 years. But I did grow up on a river. I grew up on a river
Yeah.
estuary, grew up somewhere where, on the Somerset Levels, very watery place, on an estuary where, in the Bristol Channel, estuary of a small river going into the Bristol Channel. The Bristol Channel has the highest rise and fall of any tide in Europe, and so when we were children, we would go out over to the riverbank. I mean, because we just were free to do whatever in those days, and sometimes
Mm,
we get there and there'd just be this huge river and water or lake,
yeah.
depending. And another time it would just be mud, as far as the eye could see. But
Yeah.
it was a very, yeah. So I thought, well, I am a child of the river myself, in a way.
Yes. Like Ayana.
Yeah, like Ayana. And for
Maybe we
me, that
should open up
landscape,
like Ayana.
pardon, sorry,
I think
I
maybe
missed that.
time's ticking by, and
Yeah. So
yeah,
I
I'm sorry, I think I'm breaking
that
up a
was
bit.
so interesting. So I was kind of struggling to find a moment to interrupt to save because I was like,
Yeah,
no, I want to
interrupt.
hear
Yeah,
this.
yeah, yeah.
But just to say to the audience that if you have any questions, kind of now's the moment to add them to the chat. If anyone's feeling shy, I can kickstart it. But just write them down and I'll read them out for you. But I was just wondering, I was kind of really interested in how you were talking about kind of this is like an emotional endeavor, but then there was a lot of research, so it was a kind of intellectual project. But I was just kind of wondering whether there was ever a moment that you were like, oh, I want to add this to the story, I want to add this to the plot, but then you did some research and you thought it's not feasible. This cannot historically have happened or anything like that.
Um, I I can't offhand recall anything quite like that, but there were definitely things that I thought I would have happen in the plot that didn't happen. And there were things, for instance, there was a time in the novel when Phoebe was pregnant now, and I forgot that I'd made her pregnant. And then I'm writing and I'm thinking I probably parked them. I probably put them in the car park, like I said before. And then I'm writing and thinking, oh God, didn't I make Phoebe pregnant? And then I had to think about that, and I thought, no, that's too much. That's going to be another big, awful drama, really. And something I wanted to avoid was one awful, awful drama after another, because that's what you often get with these things. And um, especially if they're about prison, you get prisoner cell block H or something like that, and it's just one awful thing after another. And
Yes.
so I decided it I wasn't going to make her pregnant. So it doesn't really quite answer your question, but certainly, there were things I thought about doing that I didn't do, and that was one of them.
No, that's really interesting. It's part and parcel of creating a novel from scratch. We have a
Same.
question from Margot, and Margot says, I absolutely loved the novel, April. I read it in a day. The ending is perfect. Was there a point early on in the story when you knew this would happen?
Well, I think I knew that she had to get out of the asylum. I mean, I wasn't going to leave her there for ever. I'm not quite sure what Margot means. Does she mean that she would get out of the asylum, or do you mean the place, Margot, or that she ends up in?
Yeah, she means that she would get
Yes,
out.
that's right. Yeah. Yeah, I think I always felt that I can never, I don't think I can ever. I like writing about dark things. I do explore dark things in my writing.
Mm.
Um, but I really like to have hope, and I'm not gonna I couldn't have left her there. I could not have left her there. So yeah, probably early, very early on. But I didn't know how or why. I knew she would have to meet all these obstacles because that's how it works, isn't it? And I didn't know till quite
Yeah.
late on how she would actually get out, but I knew she would. Okay.
Okay, so unless anyone else has any questions, I can hand it over to Lynn for a potentially very quick last question.
Um, you said that you had a favorite character. Oh, wait a minute, there's another one come in from Anna.
Yeah, so
Thank
Anna
you.
says,
Any
hi, Ivor and
question there?
Lynn. Thank you for an interesting and wide-ranging talk. I'm yet to read the book, but will buy after day. How did you decide on the three
Good.
female characters?
How did I decide on the three?
Female characters.
Female.
Okay. Well, I think, as I said, I already had Alice, who Alice is actually a mixture of two characters from two different short stories set in Cambridgeshire. One of those characters was a simpler, a wise woman, a herbalist, which Alice is. And the other was a woman who's incarcerated in the asylum. So I put them together and made Alice. And then the other bits that were missing from that, I kind of put into Simone. And I'd all in the short story Phoebe also already exists because my character in the short story is going to make a she's trying to become a botanist and going to make a collection of wild flowers of the area, and she finds the girl Phoebe Baines, and Phoebe is going to draw them for her. And of course, in the Silent Women, Phoebe does begin to draw and paint. So they were nearly all there from my short story. That's really where they came from. And where they came from before that, I can't remember. It's too far back.
I like the way they
So
spill over from the short stories, Avril, into the
yeah,
novel, that they
I need
cross
to
the
find
boundaries.
I need to find another short story now so I can start on the next, another short story to start on the next novel.
Well, you've written so many short stories. You've written so many, and they're all so different. Okay, I think anything else from our audience tonight? I think you've given a really good feel for what you've done here, Avril.
I hope so.
I hope people can take away um yeah, a pretty strong feel for the way you write and what you've written and what the novel's like. And I can
Good.
just tell people if you want to buy this book, please go to our website, Linen Press, www.linen-press.com. Um, and
And can
otherwise, thank you all for, yes, yes.
I also want to thank everyone, Lynn, but could I just also make a small plea that if you have read it and you have enjoyed it, it would be brilliant if you felt you could put something on Amazon, because it just, although we don't especially like Amazon and we're
Yeah.
not going to buy it, it does in the wider world, it counts for something. And it doesn't have to be a long, just a line that, I really enjoyed this novel and whatever, that's all it takes. So if you feel you can, I would be really grateful. Sorry, Lynn. Sorry
Yes, I
to interrupt.
second that. No, it's fine. I second that. The more reviews we can have up and that are visible, the more Amazon's little whatever they are work away in the background and push the novel out there for other people to notice it. What are they? Algebraic something or other.
Oh,
So yeah, short reviews. Even if you just say I really enjoyed it, that'd be very welcome. So I want to thank Aisling again. Thank you so much, Aisling, for setting this up. And it's all run
thank you.
beautifully, very smooth, no hiccups. And we run these online events once a month. Next month, Maureen Freely will be talking about her new novel, My Blue Peninsula, set in Istanbul. So more place, a lot more place and sense of place. And thank you, Avril, most of all, for talking to us about your
Thank
work and talking about it so clearly and so honestly and openly. It's lovely to hear you speak about your stories and your characters. So thank you
Well,
all, and
thank you. Thanks, everyone. Yeah.
I hope you've
Um,
gained something from tonight's
and
event.
right before I say goodbye, I just want to say how Susan Clegg says it's a beautifully written book. Really enjoyed it, puts you in the moment, as you said at the start. And then Sarah M also said, thanks so much. And I'm looking forward to reading the book and that she will not be buying it from Amazon.
Oh, good. Thank you.
But thank you
Thank you very
everyone
much,
for coming.
everybody.
And thank you to the two of you for such an interesting
Bye.
discussion. Bye.
You. Bye.
Bye. Bye, everybody.